32 to 41. We're going to be reading from Matthew chapter 24, verses 32 to 41. So Matthew chapter 24, verse 32 to 41. I'll read aloud for us. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. And that is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a hand mill, one will be taken and the other left. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. So we're continuing on with this series from Matthew chapter 24, where Jesus teaches the disciples about what to look for when Jesus were to return. And we know that for the believer, the return of Jesus Christ is something that we really do need to reflect quite a bit about, as it is the source of our joy, the source of our hope, and in many ways the source of our strength. And I say this to us that even in the midst of all the difficulties that Jesus talks about when his time to return will come about, we have this hope and strength in knowing that Jesus will return, because above all things, we know that on that day, sin will be no more. That Jesus will come and place judgment upon sin once for all, and sin will no longer exist in our eternal life. We know this will happen because Jesus will come and he will bring judgment upon all sin, both from those of the living and the dead, as we have professed in the Apostles' Creed. So all people who have ever existed will stand before God. And for those of us who are the believers, we believe that God will look at us and not see our wickedness, but will see the righteousness of Christ. Why? Because while God has to place judgment upon all sin, as believers, we believe that God's judgment upon sin was placed on Christ on our behalf. And because God is a just God, he does not violate the principle of double jeopardy, meaning he does not punish the same crime or the same sin twice. It is a principle that exists even in our legal system. But for those who don't believe, it's not that they were worse people than the Christians, or it's that they were terrible, but it's the fact that they had chosen to have accountability and judgment for their lives and for their sins upon themselves. That they rejected that their sins would be placed upon Christ, but that their lives would be placed upon themselves. And unfortunately, as Paul says in Romans, all people will have fallen short of the glory of God. All of us will stand before God as sinners, and that sin must be accounted for, that sin must be judged, and either it will be placed upon Christ or it will be placed upon ourselves. And as we've been studying and reflecting on these different themes, each week we've been going through a different aspect of what Jesus talks about upon his return. And today we're going to be talking about time. Time. It's a very interesting thing for Jesus to talk about as a theme towards his return, but Jesus tells us that time will accelerate at a much faster rate when he returns. And I think that we see this actually happening all the time. So for example, in verse 38 to 39, he gives the example of what happened during the time of Noah, where he says that people became very, very busy, and each day passed by so quickly. What were they doing each day? Where they were eating, and they were drinking, and they were marrying, and they were giving into their marriage. I mean, they were eating, drinking, getting married, and living their life in a merry kind of way. Doesn't seem like that's a big problem, but let me talk to you about what's happened in that way. It's that each day moved by so quickly. And we see this happening even today. We know this in many ways. For example, with technology. For those of us who are older, we realize that, man, I was thinking back, and it's like, I don't know, for those of you who are younger, you guys know what a beeper is, right? I realized I had the same beeper my whole high school life, right? Because the technology for beepers did not change, right? What existed my freshman year was the same kind of beeper I needed my senior year. And I'm thinking to myself, every single year, I feel the need to have to get a new cell phone. Because somehow this iPhone, right, gets so quickly outdated, and it becomes so laggy, and the battery life is so terrible, right? So every year we find ourselves in that kind of way. You know, I think about someone like my father who had his car, his Oldsmobile, like 20 years of his life, right? And nowadays, we're thankful if our cars give us no problems after 5 years, right? So technology has allowed us to realize that, man, life goes by so quickly. Things get so outdated so quickly. We see this even with economics, with inflation. Things are getting so expensive so fast. Cost of living, rent is rising up so fast beyond what we sometimes feel capable of affording. Even I think about many of you guys who are young students, right? And I feel burdened for you. Why? Because by the time you're 14, somehow there's this pressure to have figured out your whole life. Because there's this pressure that, man, you need to know what you want to become, what career you want to have, so that you know what schools you want to go to. And in order to know what schools you want to go to, you have to know what kind of internships and residencies and what kind of like volunteer work and what kind of GPA and SAT score you need. And you need to have that all figured out by the time you start high school so that you're already on the fast and right track. And so by the time you're 14, there is this burden and pressure to know your whole life. Right? And so we see these happenings in every fabric of our lives. Life is going at such a fast pace. So it resonates with us what Jesus says, that life will only get faster and faster and faster. As an uncle, and for those of you who are parents, you probably feel this even more than I do. Whenever I look at my nephews and my niece, I'm reminded of that. Like, why does time seem to go by so quickly? How are they already another year older, another grade higher? And Jesus is using that theme, and he compares it to the time of Noah, where he says that people were living at a time where things were going by, each day was going by so quickly. But the problem during the time of Noah was, as I shared with you, is that they lived their lives each day eating, drinking, getting married, and getting into their marriage. And you might hear that, but what is so problematic about any of those things? Eating seems like a wonderful thing that I do. Drinking is as moderation seems like a thing that I do, that I enjoy, right? I want to get married, right? I want to be able to enjoy that marriage. So none of those things in of itself seems like a bad thing. But what Jesus tells us as to what's been happening at that time is the people's lives during the time of Noah was singularly focused on just those things, where they were just trying to get by each day, where I just want to have a semblance of joy, so I eat, I drink, and I enjoy my marriage. And yet all these things about God's kingdom and all these signs about what was to happen, they were completely oblivious to. They were so busy just trying to live their lives for whatever pleasures they can each day. Each day passed by, and they just never remembered God. They never lived for him. And I want to share this with you because you might think to yourself, oh, I would never do that. But here's the thing, is that the people that Jesus is talking about during the time of Noah were not like unbelievers. He wasn't talking about the pagans. Because when you read Genesis, you'll actually be talking about people who were familiar with the stories of Abraham, with the stories of Adam and Eve, and familiar with the things that have happened. They were descendants of that line. They knew of all the things that God had done. And yet, while they were familiar with the stories, they were familiar with the name of the Lord, they were familiar with these things, here they were, getting sidetracked, just getting so busy living life, that their eyes were completely shut down and blinded to the things of God and to the things that God was doing. And you might think to yourself, is that really that big a deal? Why is that so problematic? Because what it does in the long term, it really does suck out the purpose of why you're here on this earth. Because all of us here were created right? God created you, and God breathed life into you, and God placed you on this earth for a significant purpose. We don't sometimes know with clarity what that is. But we're not here just simply to exist. We're not here just simply to survive. Our life's purpose is not just to live and then one day to die. That's not the summation of who we're supposed to be. For each and every one of you, and for each and every one of your children, God has innate love and purpose for your lives. And what was happening during the time of Noah, as life was getting so and so fast and accelerated, was that each day was lived simply to survive, to enjoy, and perhaps to think, well, the things of God I'll do tomorrow. But then tomorrow would come, and it would be, once again, I'll do that tomorrow. And I want to challenge each and every one of us here that as life is passing by so quickly, it is understandable that sometimes we lose track and we say to ourselves, oh, but right now, God, I need to focus on these things. But we need to be mindful of the reality of what God Jesus talks about during the times of Noah, which is it can get very easy to get lost into that. It can get so easy to simply have to work for the purposes of making money, for the purposes of paying my mortgage, and that becomes the summation of your life. I was just somebody who worked, who made a paycheck. It can become very easy, right, to just simply exist and to wash dishes and to stay at home and to watch the children and do that, and then the summation of your life is simply, I'm just somebody who took care of my children. And it's not to say any of those things are bad, just like eating or drinking or getting married is a bad thing. But when describing the generation of the time of Noah, that's all that can be described about them. That they ate, they drank, and got married. And your whole life, brothers and sisters, was not to be summarized as he existed, she existed, and that's it. And that's the challenge that we have to face. Is that in the busyness of our lives, we can get lost in that busyness, and then suddenly it becomes that we simply exist, and that's it. And we lose out on the purposes and the vision, and even in the love and the great works of God all around us. The other thing we see from today's passage is this, that Jesus clarifies that absolutely no one, I say this, not even the angels, not even Jesus at that moment himself, would know when Jesus will return. Right? So he's making it very, very clear that, look, as he has shared with us in previous verses, there are plenty of signs for you to look for his return, such as the rise of false messiahs and the rise of false prophets and the rise of false teachings. There's also going to be the rise of wars and the rise of natural calamities. And when Jesus says that there will be a rise of these things, he's talking that there will be an increase of frequency and intensity, meaning that they will happen more frequently, and each time you'll see over a period of time that they start to get more and more intense. Right? He says this is one of those signs that you should look for. But the reality is, the specific day, the specific moment, no one knows except for God, the Father. And there are a lot of reasons as to why that is the case. But I think to myself, one of the reasons why I think God does not let anybody know when he's going to return is our human nature. I don't know for you guys how you were when your parents went away, but when my parents went away, my parents decided that they were going to go at a conference or some retreat, and my sister and I would be alone for like 4 days. My parents would leave us a list of things to do, like please do the dishes, make sure you do your homework, and there's a list of things you ought to do, right? And the reality is, if I knew that my parents were not going to, if they left on Monday and they were going to return on Friday, do you know when I did all those things? Friday, right after I got back from school, right? I started vacuuming, right? I started doing all of my homework for the week, right? I started doing all the dishes. My sister and I were doing tag team. We were like, yo, do this, go there. And we were doing everything in that very short moment. Because we understood what we had to do, but because we knew when my parents were going to return, reality is our laziness and our procrastination got the better of us. And each day we're like, oh, we'll do it later. And then suddenly we realize, oh man, my parents come home tonight. We got to do this now. And we try to make up for a week's worth of things that we have to do in a matter of a short few hours. And the reality is, I think that for many of us, if we knew exactly when Jesus would return, I think you'd see a whole lot of people as the children of God living their lives in that same exact way. Oh, wait, Jesus is going to return in like 2 years? Okay, then I'll start taking my faith seriously maybe the day before. I'll start going to church then. But the problem with that is that that's not, once again, God is not a God of legalism where he was concerned about what did you do only, but he's concerned about who you are and also about the matter of the heart. And so you can, if we do that in that kind of way, yes, we can say to God, but God, I did this, I did all these things, I did all the things you twisted me to do. But as Jesus reveals in Matthew, is there are plenty of people who will one day say to God, but God, I prophesied for you and I healed people for you, I did all these things for you. And Jesus will look at them and say, I don't know you. Right? Because Jesus does not recognize the heart and the person of who they were. And that's the problem of our human nature, is that we think to ourselves, great, so the moment I know when Jesus returned, that's when I'll start focusing and doing all these things. And yet, unfortunately, we miss out on the heart and the purpose of what God is trying to do. He's focused on who you are, who you're becoming, and the matters of your heart. And we're only focusing on the list of things that we got to do. And so because I think God knows that and is familiar with that about us, he makes it very clear, not one of you, not one of us, not anybody in the history of mankind will ever know exactly the moment Jesus will return. And in many ways, while it is stressful, that is such an unknown thing, in many ways, it really is a blessing. And how is it a blessing? Well, it does a couple of things. Number one is, when we realize that we don't know when our lives are going to come to an end, and we have to start thinking about our mortality, the fact that we won't live forever, it refocuses us. It refocuses our priorities, it refocuses our principles, it refocuses our very purpose of what we're doing and why we're living. Why do I say that? You know, as a pastor's kid, and also as a pastor who's pastored at several elderly churches, I've literally been there on people's deathbeds. Right? I volunteered at a hospice, I've been there for different congregation members, and I've been there for family members where literally, right, I was sitting next to them as they breathed their last breath, right? And in those final days, as I'm with them, there's an interesting thing that always happens to every single person. It doesn't matter if they're Christian, not Christian, whatever else is. They start talking to me about their life. Because as they realize that these are the final days, they start talking about their life and their regrets. And usually their life regrets are not like, man, I really wish I had invested into Google when my friend told me to. It's usually not that. It's usually not things like, man, I really wish I had worked some more overtime so I could have made a little bit more money. Usually there's a clarity about their priorities and their principles and their purpose as they say things like, man, I wish I had told my wife one more time how much I love her. You know, families that were broken apart, I think to myself how much in that moment I hated my siblings or how much I hated my children, and I asked myself, what was that all about? Right? Suddenly there is a reshifting of priorities and principles and purpose. Things that, man, someone did 20 years ago that they lived their whole life resenting and having filled their hearts and their life with hatred and bitterness, and as their life is about to come to an end, they ask themselves, what was the point of 20 years of hating that person? What did it amount to? What did it mean? So there is a reshifting and a refocusing of their priorities and their principles and their purpose as they realize that their life is about to come to an end. And I understand that for most of us here, thinking about our mortality and thinking about the reality that our lives will one day come to an end is not a pleasant thing to think about. The idea that Jesus will come back on this earth and that life will end as we know it is not exactly the most fun topic to have during Bible study. And yet, it is an important thing for us to consider. Why? Because like many of those people who are on their deathbeds, perhaps it's important for us to refocus our priorities, our principles, and our purpose, but do it now. Why? Because the difference is this: those people on their deathbed, that refocusing did absolutely nothing for that. It was too late. For us, refocusing can become very powerful as it changes the trajectory of how we are living our lives. And so, to help you with that, I want to challenge you to think about these questions. If today, if quite literally today, after this service, we would hear the trumpets cry and the heavens opening up and the presence of Jesus Christ coming down upon this earth, and all of us now, our lives were to come before an end. Ask yourselves this question: what would God say about our lives? When he looks upon us, when he looks upon me, upon YJ, as I stand before him in his full glory, and God is looking and evaluating my life, what would God say about my life? As I'm standing before God with all of you, my congregation, my community, my church, my family, what would my neighbors, what would you say about my life? What is the testimony of it? And as I'm being humbled by the presence of God, now I have to think to myself, what would I say about my own life? See, these are very humbling things, but we should consider them, these questions. The third and final thing that we'll see from today's story, or passage, is this: that there is a huge difference between just surviving and living, between existing and truly living. And to illustrate this point, Jesus gives this comparison about these stories about these two men who are working in the field, or these two women who are working on a hand mill. And as they were working, suddenly one disappeared, one left, and the other was left behind. So one left and the other was remaining, meaning that one was raptured, the other stayed behind, was left behind on this earth. And I think Jesus does this in this kind of way to give us some very key principles for illustration, which is, what's interesting is that these are two similar people from the same socioeconomic class. It's not that one was in any physical way better than the other, right? Socioeconomically, they were the same. The work that they were doing was the same. Their time hours were the same, right? So in all outwardly appearance, there were two people that were the same. These two men and these two women. And yet, from God's perspective and God's view, he saw two very different lives. To the point that while all of us would be like, what was the difference? God says one of them will be rewarded by being raptured, by being rescued, and going to heaven, and the other would be left behind to face the wrath and judgment of God. Why? And it's amazing because we don't get too much detail about it, but understanding the context of what Jesus talks about in the earlier verses, we realize that even these two people who were doing the exact same work were living their lives in completely different ways. One was just surviving each day to day, working to survive and to survive and to survive, and yet the other, while they were doing the same exact kind of work in the field or in the hand mill, one truly lived. One truly lived in such a way that it pleased and blessed and honored the heart of God. That God says, I want to bless you and reward you. Come near to me. And so please do not think to yourselves as you're hearing my sermon that I'm telling you, live your life differently. Come out to church more often, or stop going on vacations, or stop going out with your friends to go to restaurants. No, that's none of those things. Somehow it's very possible that you can be the two people where you're living your life outwardly in the same way where, yes, you are going on those family vacations, and yes, you are going out to eat with your friends, and yes, you are going to do whatever you wanted to do, those things, and yet your life in the eyes of God is completely different. So the point isn't do things differently, but it's about being a different person, where your life and your heart is completely different, where somehow working right? The purpose of your working isn't simply to make a paycheck, where somehow simply, right, you're being at home and doing the dishes and vacuuming is not simply only to have a clean home, but somehow, even though the things you are doing, even after this service, are exactly the same, who you are and the heart by which you do those things are completely different, and God sees that. And not only will God see that, but in many ways you will see that within yourself as well. I want to challenge you to just take some time to pray and to really ask yourselves, giving you some time to really pray the questions that we were asking earlier. And reflect on your life. And ask yourselves, if this was it, if today is the last day that I were to be here on this earth, what would God say about my life? And what would my neighbors, what would those that I call my neighbors, my family, my friends, what would others say about my life? And be honest with yourself, what would I say about my life? And I know these aren't easy questions and pleasant questions, but perhaps they're questions that need to be asked and reflected upon. And maybe it's not just a question that you can only ask in this moment, because 2-3 minutes is not going to give you the full answer, but maybe it's about disciplining ourselves to at least ask, just start asking ourselves these things. And to pray, Lord, may my life be glorifying and pleasing to you, even if I'm doing the same exact thing. Secondly is, ask yourselves, are you truly living, or are you just surviving each day? Do you understand that who you are, that you are here existing, not only to exist? The summation of your life, as it was for the people of the time of Noah, should not be that you ate, drank, and got married. I pray that the summary of your life, that the testimony of your life, is not that you were born, you went to school, you got a job, and you died. There is something within the heart of God that He created you wonderfully and beautifully, and it's found within the purposes of Him. So pray that God would help you refocus your priorities, your principles, and your purpose, so that your life would be fully